Hi, this is novelist and screenwriter C. Courtney Joyner.
Hi, my name is Amanda Reyes, and I'm the editor and co-author of Are You in the House Alone? A TV Movie Compendium, 1964 to 1999.
And we're here to talk about Ginger in the Morning. And Amanda, I'm very excited. We've known each other forever, and this is the first project we've ever done as co-hosts.
Yeah, I think it's really important, too, that it be a Monte Markham project, because I know we're both huge fans of this actor.
Yes, we are. And as an actor and as a really good fellow.
Yeah. And I think this is such an interesting film. It was kind of unknown when it came out. It didn't have a huge theatrical release. It has an interesting history, a really interesting history. And it catches Sissy Spacek just right before she exploded. And it also ends up being kind of a really interesting artifact for the filmmaker himself, Mark Miller, who also is one of the stars of this film. So I'm really excited to talk about all of that.
Well, and you just hit on something that really is kind of important to its history. Is it was not widely distributed. It didn't do particularly well. And because of that, it had a television sale very quickly on the heels of its production. And it has been bundled over the years with television movies. And a lot of people have had the impression that this was made for TV.
Yeah, it definitely plays like a TV movie, and I kind of think that the disc I got it with. So this was in public domain for a long time, and I guess it still is. But it came out on a double pack, I think, with The Strangers in 7A with Andy Griffith, which is a TV movie, and I think you're right. It was always seen with these packs with all these other made-for-TV films, and it plays like one. I mean, this is the antithesis of the type of hitchhiking film you would have seen in the theater at this time. It does everything sort of in the opposite of what we would see in movies like The Hitchhikers, which is that Fred and Beverly Sebastian film from 1972, much grittier, right, than something like this. So it's a really fascinating curio on top of everything else.
And also the cast alone, just because there's Monte Markham, and this is around the time of the new Perry Mason, and he constantly worked in television. And so he was a TV face at this point. And here with David Doyle in his wonderful cameo as the nosy buddy he meets on the plane who has all kinds of advice on how to get women.
All kinds of bad advice.
Yes, very bad advice.
But he's wonderful in this, and he would get attached later on with Mark Miller. So Mark Miller, who we'll get into later, he shows up sort of in the second act of this film, wrote and produced and made this film. And one of the interesting things about this is he might be better known for a movie he did that came out in 1982 called Savannah Smiles. But when he originally wrote that, it was just right after this film, and he had attached David Doyle to that project originally. Now, David Doyle didn't end up in the 1982 version. But I think Miller formed some friendships on this because there's a lot of names that you will see in the credits that reappear. Also, he worked with Slim Pickens on a couple of things, and the producer Clark Palo. So it was, in a way, it's kind of a family affair.
Oh, very much so. And going to that is, you mentioned the other hitchhiking movies, and of course, we think of that, particularly if you're thinking about drive-in flicks and the type of movie that Crown International was making and distributing, where young hitchhiker, she either gets in trouble with the guy who picks her up, or she's crazy, or whatever, and the hard R exploitation stuff that usually went along with the genre. And this flew directly in the face of that approach. This is a very, if you will, G-rated movie that actually deals with some pretty adult subjects, but the approach is not the drive-in approach.
Yeah, and I want to comment on that, but briefly I want to say I believe this is Wendy Wiles, who is the director's wife, Gordon Wiles' wife. And the other stewardess we'll see later with Mark Miller is actually his then wife, Beatrice Miller. So when I talk about family affair, I mean this was a family affair. But you're absolutely right that this movie kind of, in a way, gives a middle finger to those types of films. And I think that that's important, especially when you think about Miller's career as a writer. He liked to write family entertainment. It was a big passion of his. And I think it's interesting that he took this film, and I'm guessing because he was a very prominent actor at this point and had already written a produced screenplay for Please Don't Eat the Daisies, which was the sitcom that I think he was best known for as an actor. And he was really passionate about this idea of making films for everybody. But you're right, he does deal with a lot of heady topics, and I think that that's kind of really interesting, and it also plays into the world of TV movies, because TV movies were always taking on hot button topics, and putting them out in sort of this mass marketed, almost vanilla way. And that's not to dismiss how they handle them, but when you think you're going to reach a mass audience, sometimes you want the message to fall somewhere in the middle and let the audience kind of interpret what they want. But you can introduce all kinds of things. I mean, look at what All in the Family was doing, on
sure.
TV, and all the TV movies were talking about things that were happening in here, particularly infidelity, unwed mothers, this sort of makeshift family thing, which is a theme we'll see repeated in Mark Millar's films. And it's really interesting that he took a really gritty topic, and we'll probably talk about, if we can, a little later, about the history of hitchhiking and how women played a part in that, and how they were seen as like easy, or looking for trouble, or maybe even looking to slum it. It was never seen as a positive thing. And here we've got a pretty interesting independent woman who kind of is able to like eke out a life for herself through the guise of hitchhiking. And that's kind of fascinating to me.
Well, again, this is, if you will, looking at what they call, quote unquote, hippie culture, from the older middle-aged businessman's standpoint and viewpoint, and hits on, as we know, very much the same themes as Clint Eastwood's movie Breezy,
Yes.
which was made the same year. But Breezy, of course, is more explicit, and there's a intense love affair in it. However, Breezy is also a great portrait from that era of Los Angeles. And this film is set in New Mexico, where it was made. But other than, if you will, architecture and what have you, isn't, I would say, embedded in the culture of New Mexico.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I might have an opposite. I think I agree with you. It's not embedded in the culture of New Mexico, but it really captures the landscape in a really interesting way. And actually, the first time I saw Ginger in the Morning, many years ago now, what I recall most about it is actually these opening scenes where they're out in the beauty of the landscape. And I think Mark Millar had a real eye for landscape, which we'll see in all of his films. But yeah, it's not embedded in the culture, but there's something about it that I think feeds the aesthetic of the film in a really beautiful way. There's no other state like New Mexico, and they had just established the New Mexico Film Commission. I think just a year or so, no, it was 1968 that they established it. So it was fairly new when they had created it. And it plays a big part, actually, in the making of this film. As a matter of fact, I think the governor, I think it was Bruce King at the time, was really involved with Mark Millar in promoting New Mexico as another Hollywood.
Well, they were trying very hard, especially after, because of tax breaks and things like that. And the movie that they were targeting that could be done for little money, of course, in New Mexico, was Easy Rider.
Yes.
And then Warner Brothers came with The Cowboys, which with one of our co-stars, Slim Pickens, and a fellow named John Wayne. And, New Mexico started to see an uptick in its film production, but also, too, a lot of it was Westerns. A lot of it was period.
Yeah, well, definitely the landscape feeds into that too. You know what I mean? And you are right. There's not a lot of referencing. There is this really neat moment when they get back to his house where they talk about the indigenous culture there, and he calls out the Navajo people in particular. And I find that's kind of a sensitive to mark out the tribe that he's actually really interested in. He talks about their language and how he moved from New York to New Mexico because the land was so beautiful. And I think it's not a postcard for New Mexico, but I definitely think it is promoting like sort of the mystique and the beauty and how it is a little different than some of the other states.
And there is, yes, absolutely this idea of Ginger representing, if you would, the open highway, but also the freedom of a lifestyle that we have. Monte Markham's character, this is completely foreign to him, which is also part of the appeal of, I think, of the hitchhiker genre, especially if the hitchhiker introduces another character to their lifestyle.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about how this movie doesn't demonize hitchhiking. And I don't want to say this is a pro hitchhiking film or it's saying go out and hitchhike, but normally hitchhiking films where the woman is the hitchhiker, it's often seen as a quote unquote cautionary tale. And here, I think the cautionary tale is actually rooted in the fact that he's taking somebody, David Doyle's, bad advice to just go out and have sex. And when that's not really where the character of Joe's heart is. And so if it's any kind of cautionary tale, it's actually his story. And I find that really fascinating too. That's not something you would normally see in these kind of films or in any exploitation film of this type, I would think.
No, you're absolutely right. And of course, what we're going to see here in this next little moment with the hotel clerk, and it's kind of the way Markham's character is built, is there are these open signals from this girl. There are these moments where it's like, yes, why don't you take the next step? And he always stops himself and
Yes.
stumbles.
Yes, and in humorous ways. I wanted to mention that this is Harry Luck as the motel clerk. So he was a local actor. He was huge on the Albuquerque scene, and he had appeared the year before he made this opposite Virginia Mayo in a production of Cactus Flower. He was actually a Cadillac salesman, but he did theater on the side. Another film that he might be recognized for is Thomasine and Bushrod. He played the sheriff in that. And he's quite good in this very small part. And actually, a lot of locals appear in this. All the extras are cast locally, and most of them clearly were not actors. And I don't mean by their approach to the dialogue, but like they're very just regular people. And a matter of fact, the maitre d' I think we're coming up on in the next scene when they get to what I think is the Four Seasons, I'm not positive, was actually a real estate salesman who was cast in that part. So there's a lot of local flavor floating around the film as well. I guess that's what I mean when I talk about like it's not embedded in the culture, but there's something about the aesthetic that's very tangible to me.
Well, you're also hitting on something that goes to directly to Mark Miller, who, by the way, we should mention is the father of Penelope Ann Miller.
That's right.
And he was always, from the very beginning, and we'll talk about his theater work, but he was a stage animal. And he always returned to the stage, whether it was on Broadway or in community theater or whatever, but he always kept his hand in live performance and theater and working with veteran actors and inexperienced actors. And that was just part of his entire career and his life. And he never turned his back on it. And I think that was also something that he enjoyed when making independent movies like this or Savannah Smiles, was taking advantage of, if you will, and not in the bad way, of local talent and people who had not yet had opportunities, and he gave them opportunities.
Including Sissy Spacek, who's relatively unknown at this point. And what a great choice that was. And it's interesting that you bring up his theater work because Ginger in the Morning actually started as a play. The play didn't get produced till the year after this film was released in 74. We should add that this production began in March of 1972. There are conflicting dates. Like IMDb will say March 20th, but the newspapers at the time, the local papers, say March 6th. And I'm not sure if that's when rehearsal started or actual film production, but there were pictures in the newspapers, the local papers, of Clark Palo and Mark Miller and David Doyle, I believe, setting up the scenes in Albuquerque at the airport. And then there were scenes of Susan Oliver and Sissy Spacek rehearsing. Those were done on the 10th of March or showed up in the newspaper. But it was a play, and I think that kind of feeds into this idea of giving it a TV movie feel because it's not an uncinematic film at all. It's very beautiful to look at, but it is got a small cast. It only really has a couple of sets, and it's kind of telling a more, not domestic story, but a more personal story about this couple and about the relationship between Charlie and Joe, which is also a really important element of the film. So it's not telling these big stories, and where theatricals would tell the big public stories, TV movies were known for telling the private stories. And this does have a very kind of domestic undertone to it when we find out about her character being pregnant and this idea of who's going to help her with the child and what she's going to do with it. That's a very kind of private story too. And so it's not surprising to me that it started at a play, but I was really fascinated that that's where its origins were. And when it did go into production, Heather Menzies played Ginger. So I think Miller just had a real eye for talent.
And also, too, with when you think about his age, Monte Markham's age, and everybody, they're probably a little bit young for the idea of a male midlife crisis, but that's also very much what this movie is about. We've ended a marriage or we've ended a relationship. What do I do now? I'm completely out of step with dating ritual and all of that stuff, which we see in Monty's case because he just keeps stumbling because this is not something he has done in probably 20 years. And that's always the reoccurring theme, I think, usually with an older man and especially a very young woman. And she's actually showing him the world, not the other way around.
Yeah, that's always really interesting to me when they do something like that. And she's such a great character because she is this sort of comes out of like the hippie movement, but the promotion of love in this film, I think, is really interesting. And of course, that comes out of the counterculture. But like, I like that she's such a joyful character, but not without. She's very independent, and we'll see later when she overhears Markham and Miller's character talking about how she's like an quote unquote easy mark. They don't say that exactly, but that's what Markham is saying, trying to get Miller out of the house, and the way she kind of like advocates for herself. And so I don't think that this is a feminist film by any leaps or bounds or anything like that, but I do think it does have a female centric viewpoint during certain parts of the film that are really, really captivating to me.
Well, for Sissy Spacek, and the idea of when the production dates and things like that, they seem a little fog shrouded at times, especially when you're researching this movie. Because I ran into exactly the same thing with Sissy Spacek's career. Of course, we have Badlands, and that technically came after this, but then. In her own book, she writes about the fact that Badlands did not open the doors that she thought it would once she saw the movie, which of course was absolutely wonderful and is a classic. And she went through a weird career period where she was not given a lot of opportunities. In fact, she went to episodic television before coming back for the TV movie Catherine, where she played the student radical, and then after that, Carrie.
Yeah, she also did what I think is a really interesting TV movie in this era. I think it was the year before this came out, called The Girls of Huntington House, which was directed by Alf Julien, which looks like Kjellin, but is pronounced Julien. And he was actually a protege of Ingmar Bergman, a real interesting filmmaker. And that movie has a lot of parallels to Ginger in the Morning, in that Sissy Spacek plays this kind of hippie type character who finds herself pregnant. And she ends up at a house for, back in the 70s, girls would sometimes get sent away to these places to have their baby and then usually give it up for adoption or maybe keep it. But it's sort of this halfway house for pregnant women. And Shirley Jones plays this new teacher at the school. And she sort of becomes the Markham character in that Sissy Spacek is this kind of like young, kind of idealistic hippie, but her viewpoint about being open emotionally really feeds into this need that Shirley Jones has, because she plays this really kind of buttoned up character, much like Markham. And they both characters, both Markham here as Joe and Shirley Jones' character in The Girls of Huntington House, need this kind of young idealistic person to help them open up themselves to the world around them. And I also find it interesting that both characters are pregnant and they both come out of the counterculture movement. So now that, of course, is a TV movie, so I don't think it's as widely known, but I find it to be an interesting companion with this. And if anybody's interested, they should really check it out.
Well, whenever you see talent like Sissy Spacek on this on the verge point of their careers, and everything is there. Everything that the next producers and next directors would want in their project is recognizable in their work. You're like, oh, of course, that she was going to take this next step into something pretty serious. Because it's just obvious, because she's luminous and she's funny and she's dear and all those things. So let's soak her in blood. I mean, this is, that's just it. And it's, so even going way, way back, again, early in the careers of people have ended up doing something incredibly significant in either film or television. That light, that speck of that talent that propels them forward is, I think, always obvious.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to me that she didn't originally start out in the world of entertainment wanting to be an actress. She was a musician.
Yep.
She taught herself to play the guitar, and she won this competition in Austin, Texas. And her parents were like, "Oh, you know what? She's pretty good," and they helped her get to New York, and she wanted to originally work as a studio musician, but she ended up falling into modeling. And so we should say Sissy Spacek's very small. You can see that here. She's only 5'3". That's not a normal size for a model, but she did a lot of like junior catalogs, and she actually sort of happenstance went into her management to show them, I think, some composite photos or something she had done with a photographer, and they said, "We got this call for an audition, and we think you'd be really good for it." And that's how she got Ginger in the Morning. And she had studied with Lee Strasberg or at his institute anyway, for like 3 months. But she was a really interesting actress because she said looking back, she felt like she didn't need acting school. She doesn't necessarily recommend it for people. And also she didn't like to watch a lot of movies because she felt like inevitably the more movies you watch, the more you find yourself copying another performance. And she wanted to create something from scratch, which she said she found quote unquote fun. And that was like, so she actually came into the acting world in this sort of playful manner. At least that's my understanding from this old interview I read in the early 70s. She may look back on it differently now, but and I think that playful manner is what feeds into the character of Ginger, clearly.
Well, and also, of course, too, one of the things that she maintained, which I know she actually got a little bit of criticism for, was her accent. And they're like, well, it makes you sound, do you really want the kind of this flattened out, Southern accent? And she has an unusual voice anyway. And it just makes her so different, if you will, than so many other young actresses who are kind of come walking through the door. And I know that was Robert Altman just fixated on her voice.
Yeah,
and as soon as he heard her, he said, "Oh, I've got to work with her."
Yeah, everything about her is so unique to me. She's so, like, I think you were luminescent. There's something ethereal about her. Like, and there are very few actresses that embody this kind of presence to me. I think Sybil Shepherd had it, and she has it. It's like it can't be just pulled out of you. It's part of you. And I think that's one of the reasons why she is so successful. When you watch movies like Carrie, she's playing a character, but you see not just yourself in her, but I think you see parts of her too. And she's really good at, like, I think she holds on to herself and also transforms into these other characters. And that's a rare trait.
Can't imagine what I was thinking.
And also too, just because she's this way as a person, she is always maintain a very approachable,
Yeah.
I don't want to say image, that's the wrong word, but persona, because that's just part of her personality.
Yeah, I read a recent interview with her where somebody was just a big fan of hers and somehow got an interview with her, and it was just very playful. And yeah, she's got a very likable presence. It just comes across in everything I've seen her in.
This fellow's very fond of my work.
And speaking of New Mexico, and I love this idea that Monte Markham tries to hide his artistic side from her.
Well, he's hiding a lot of stuff from her. Like, she's pretty smart, and he's like, "Oh, this is my friend's place," and he shakes that guy's hand to make it look like there's a key exchange. Like, he's trying his best to be like this kind of suave character, and he's clearly very sensitive, and all these things that I think he's been fed into from society. I think David Doyle is representing society. Like, okay, you're this divorced guy in what is the swinging 70s, and you really need to make the most of this time that you are a single guy. And by making the most of your time, that means a lot of different women, relationships that just have these very quick beginning and ends. And they even kind of talk about that here. I think Miller talks about a reference about how relationships don't end, they just fizzle out, and they don't have these big bangs. And but David Doyle's character is like, no, they have these big bangs. You come in and you come out and it's over and you go to the next one. And so Monte Markham is getting fed all of these things from society, and inside him he's thinking, yeah, no, I don't want to do that, but I feel like I should. So there's this, like, he's very, like I said about the Shirley Jones character in The Girls of Huntington House, he's very buttoned up, and he needs this person who actually needs him just as much as he needs her, but she's more open about it. And then they are able to come to understanding right at the end. But I like that. I think that this, like we talked about, like Mark Miller is looking at what all these things are happening around him, and he's saying, we don't have to be like that. And he puts it in this film, and it's such a fascinating way to do it, because I'm sure when audiences, and it did have a brief theatrical run, and of course played in drive-ins, and some of the ad campaign was a little salacious. There was one, I think it was Ginger in the Morning, Girls Are for Loving, was part of the drive-in advertisements. And I'd be curious to see what people who went and saw this thought when they didn't get exactly what they thought they were going to get.
Oh, sure. And if it was playing with some other, R-rated, if it's playing with The Van or something, and
Yeah.
you're like, what is this thing? Wait a minute. Where is the promised fun stuff from the ad? Oh, and there's Mark Miller.
And his wife, that was Beatrice Miller. They were married at the time.
And going with Mark Miller's theatrical and Broadway origins, this performance, a lot of people probably, if they're unaware, because he became so established, I think, because of his work and things like Please Don't Eat the Daisies and what have you. And Manny, you and I have said he became the good guy dad. But William Inge, the wonderful playwright, really thought Mark Miller had tremendous possibilities. And Mark Miller played Bo in the original production company of Bus Stop.
Mm-hmm.
And the original touring company of it. And, of course, Don Murray ended up playing that character in the movie. But this kind of wild side of Mark Miller's personality is very rarely demonstrated, so it's fun to see him do that here.
Oh yeah, he's great in this. And it was because of that touring production of Bus Stop that he was actually first discovered for television. Desi Arnaz saw him and cast him on the sitcom Guessword Ho, which ran from 1960 to 1961. But you're right, Please Don't Eat the Daisies would be, I think it only ran for a couple seasons, but it was his stamp on television, and I think a lot of people really saw him. It's like he didn't get typecast in the way that Robert Reed got typecast, but I think he came across as like this really like handsome, hip, thoughtful dad for a long time. And what's really interesting is where I think Robert Reed kind of tried to reject that in a lot of his movies. I'm thinking Secret Night Caller in particular, Pray for the Wildcats, and Nightmare in Badham County.
Oh, really those are all terrific.
Yeah, pivotal roles. He kind of was like, and he was doing Mannix purposely while he was doing the Brady Bunch, because he didn't want to get typecast. I don't think Mark Miller wanted to get typecast, but I don't think he ever minded being the dad. Because when you look at his other films, and even in this film, he's very fatherly. Like, he comes across first as like a little lecherous, but then he wants to like help this young woman with her baby, offering to marry her just to make the baby legitimate, which at the time would have been the thing to do, right? And so
he is. Yeah, and full of advice for his buddy and full of advice for her and what have you. And by the way, one thing I would say, this is terrific that you brought up Robert Reed because of his identity with the Brady Bunch, and then doing things like Secret Nightcaller, which I think is just wonderful. And if anyone hasn't seen it, it's about a businessman who can't help himself and he makes obscene phone calls. It's very good. I love Pray for the Wildcats. That's just TV movie gold. However, one of the things about Robert Reed that, yes, he was able to hide it to a degree, but Robert Reed had a mean streak, and you can see it. And that's why when he went dark, he was able to go as dark as he did.
Yeah, that would make sense.
And I don't think Mark Miller had really that part of his personality. Not that Robert Reed was evil or anything like that, but he was not afraid of that part of who he was.
You know what?
And I don't think Mark Miller was afraid of it. I just don't think he really possessed it. So he always came across, even in more intense dramatic work that he would do in episodic and things like Police Story and television shows like that. Still, you gravitate towards him.
Yes.
because he projects this aspect of his personality, and it just comes through. In the same way, I mean, well, of course, Monty is such a good fellow, and but now he has certainly played his fair share of baddies, and
Yes.
yes, let's not forget he drowned Christopher Lee in Airport 77 because he crashed the plane into the ocean.
He played in Melrose Place. He had a very pivotal role and just a handful of episodes where he plays Allison's dad, and we find out that he'd been molesting her when she was a teenager, and she had blocked it out, and then she comes back home, and he's there, and everything comes out in the open, and that character was dark, and he played it very well. There's things about those scenes where she confronts him that are iconic to me and iconic to nighttime soaps, I think, in general, if you watch nighttime soaps. But the way he, like, when he's confronted and he just kind of blames his wife for being frigid, you know what I mean, and things like that. And it was like Monty, because I was used to him being kind of like this really sweet and romantic hero kind of guy, because I knew him from his TV movie work where he was predominantly like the romantic lead, like in Death Takes a Holiday or The Astronaut, and he's not the romantic lead in Visions, but like this really like kind of conservative, sweet guy. And so when he plays those dark roles, and he's very good at them, that's the thing. I think he's a really underrated talent. And before we did this recording, you and I were talking about him, and I think something he doesn't always get credit for is how good he is at comedy. Because you were talking about some of his moments here, just the facial expressions that he makes when he's feeling really like overwhelmed with the situation are very funny, and he's got great delivery. And I feel like that's something that people don't like talk about enough with him. I know he was on the Golden Girls, but he kind of played a straight guy on that, as Blanche's brother. Another iconic kind of moment for him in television. But and he also came from a heavy theater background. He was in a bunch of plays, and he actually purposely wanted to do a lot of stage work before he moved over to on-screen work, because he wanted to make sure he had kind of like honed his craft to as well as he could at that point. And he had this great quote he said in 1967 in an interview. He said, quote, "Dig your well as deep as you can, because you're going to be drawing from it for the rest of your life," end quote. And he never turned his nose up on TV or these little movies like Ginger in the Morning. He's a real team player.
No, absolutely is. And his own theater background and everything else, I think, seems kind of odd, but is so well demonstrated in one of the Magnificent Seven sequels he did, Guns of the Magnificent Seven, where they literally said, look, we want you to represent Steve McQueen in this film. And his use of body language and everything in that movie it's astounding, the way that he evokes that character. It's incredible. And that comes from that training.
Yeah, he's great in everything. And it's interesting because you mentioned that he was doing the new Perry Mason at this point, and he had done the Second 100 Years in the 60s, which only lasted a season. And then he was on another show that didn't do very well either. It was called Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. And then he did Perry Mason, and I'm pretty sure he has said after that he got kind of disillusioned with series work, and then he kind of started seeking out like made-for-TV movies and theatrical work. I think the TV show stuff was kind of a grind, and he wasn't feeling a lot of success with it. Although when he did the new Perry Mason, we should mention, he was chosen out of 250 potential candidates for the part, and it is a much better show than I think people give it credit for. It's really fun. It's different, obviously, from Raymond Burr, but plenty of people have played Perry Mason in the history of that character.
Absolutely.
And I think he's just an addition to it, and he was very good in the show. I really enjoy it.
Yeah, because people always think of Perry Mason, they go straight to Raymond Burr. They don't go back to the Warner Brothers days. They don't go back to Warren William and all of that stuff. And,
he was around for a long time. But so Markham, he's really great at embodying these certain kind of characters. And I like this one because we're talking about how this movie is about hitchhiking, or starts off anyway with a female hitchhiker, and this older guy who's divorced picks her up. And I feel like this movie could go a ton of different ways, and if we'd had maybe a less sensitive leading man, it could come across as maybe a little sleazier and maybe more in line with those other films. By the way, I want to mention that this is Al Cantu, a Salvador. He was also local to New Mexico. He only had 4 on-screen appearances. One of them is Lust in the Dust in 1984, but he was a behind-the-scenes guy. He was a driver on, I think that's most of what his credits are for film, but he also did stunts, and he worked on Young Guns, and he still lives in Albuquerque.
Now, look, you've got to clear out of here with all this stuff. And your
And
friend, too. It's nothing personal,
yeah,
Salvador.
and Young Guns, of course,
Charlie, you got to clear out right
brought
now.
I already told you I'm gonna
the
clear
world
out
closer
the
to
house.
Emilio
Here,
Estevez, and
quiet as a little mouse, and I'll crash out on
the
couch.
and it was a major hit that, and this was important to New Mexico, that reinvigorated westerns for a
It
very
did,
nice
yeah.
brief period. Yep.
Yeah, and I think he's great in this, and I wish he'd been in more stuff because I think Salvador is such a fun character, such a likable. Everybody in this movie is really likable. I think, and we're coming up on her. I think, Sugar has kind of like, there's a fine line with that character, and I think that could go either way. But I think Susan Oliver's portrayal of her is quite good, and becomes more and more likable, especially when she defends Ginger later on when they're having that big argument after the New Year's Eve party.
You just got yourself out of 9
And
years of
one thing too, we were talking about Breezy earlier, that is not in this film, and goes to, I think, also Mark Miller, the way that he wrote it. There is not, if you will, this big dollop of anger towards the ex-wife who we never see for
Right.
Monte Markham's character. That is definitely not the case with William Holden's character in Breezy.
That's right.
And I think that's it's interesting because it goes against the cliche. It's probably a lot more just realistic. You know, this was, as you said, things just kind of petered out, and that was it. And Monte Markham is, if you will, kind of lost at this point because he doesn't know really what he's doing. And doesn't have this other person in his life, although he does have someone. He just doesn't know quite how to approach it and how to handle it. Certainly not from this standpoint, and especially in this scene.
Yeah, he really messes up here. And I love this moment because your heart just drops, when you see that she can hear the conversation that they're having. And you know why he's having it. He's just trying to get his friend out of that house as quick as he can. But then it comes across so badly. And I like that she doesn't put up with it, and I like that she does advocate for herself, and I like that she makes decisions for herself, and especially holding her own in a room full of men, So, like I said, I don't think this is necessarily a feminist film, but I do think that there are female-centric aspects to it, and it's definitely feeding into this idea of second-wave feminism in that she's very independent in this, and done in a very positive way. She can take care of herself. She chooses Monte Markham as much as he chooses her, and I think that that's really important for this film.
Well, and that incredible close-up, or actually I should say cowboy, of her holding the grocery bags while she's looking down from the balcony into the living room with Miller and Monty. The hurt on her face is really there.
Yeah.
And it's a terrible moment, and leading exactly right up to this with here's your change, I'm leaving, take me to the bus stop. And boy, Markham he just doesn't know what to do with himself.
He messes up a lot in this one, but in ways that I feel like aren't certainly not unforgivable. You know what I mean? And that's another thing. Like the characters have growth and are flawed, but they're not like nobody. It's what you said. They're just very likable. There's no despicable people, and that's another TV thing. Not so much with the dramas, but if you watch a lot of the made-for-TV disaster movies like Heat Wave, and I'm thinking of the Missing or Deadly would be another one. Those are instances where the disaster is the enemy and the people actually band together, and there might be an antagonist in the sense that there's maybe one person kind of holding things up, but they always come through at the end to help the community. And so this film isn't exactly doing that, but it's not about demonizing any type of person in the movie, or making the situation demonized. I love that it doesn't demonize her hitchhiking. That's real important to me. And so it's kind of fascinating. there's so many threads that I could see why people for years thought this was a made-for-TV movie, because it's not just it was packaged with these other films, but it looks and feels like a TV movie because it uses a lot of the same tropes throughout.
Honey, what are friends for?
And also, too, we should point out our great DP,
I don't believe it.
Edward Jurgensen. He was the primary director of photography on the MASH television series.
For one day.
And
Yeah,
his
another TV
back-
guy.
Yep, he was a full TV guy, and which is also Mark Miller's background. And
I'm the victim. I've already convicted.
interesting that he would choose our director, who was the primary director of Laugh-In with Rowan
That's
and Martin.
right.
Drunken bum
Yeah,
understands.
Gordon Wiles had a really fascinating career, the director of this film, because he was known predominantly for Laugh-In, and he actually started in commercials. But his TV work was in stuff like Lawrence Welk, The Magical World of Disney, so a lot of variety type shows. And then after he did this, he went into children's programming. He worked on Land of the Lost, one of my favorite shows, Big John, Little John. And he actually was named in the trades when he took over as the producer and director of the third season of New Zoo Review, which is very child orientated. I loved that show when I was a kid. And yet, at the same time, he was trying to make more adult orientated stuff. One of the things I came across was that in 1969, so before he did this, he co-wrote a screenplay called Everybody Loves Eduardo with a guy named Evan Hunter, who may have been Ed McBain, but I haven't been able to
Yes.
tie those two together. So it was interesting, but he would end up working in children's films. And that's kind of where Miller would go afterwards, because Savannah Smiles and Cowboy Mountain, which hopefully we'll get to talk about, which is another movie he made with Slim Pickens. Those are like very family friended, kid orientated films. And so this is such an interesting anomaly. Like, the more we talk about it, the more fascinated I am by the structure of the film and the premise of the film, and then what they do with it to make it like this kind of movie for everybody, when it would normally be seen as a film for a very adult market.
Oh, absolutely. And well, when you're bringing up here this idea of let's try and work things out, and everyone is showing their decent side. This is so realistic to me, that here is the fellow who's actually disrupted everything and caused all these problems as the big personality and what have you, is the one right now that she is gravitating towards. Because he at least is able to verbalize, and poor Monte Markham is there kind of stumbling all over himself and can't even get a full sentence out to apologize or do anything.
It's so funny how this all unwinds too, because she just kisses him and she's like, "Okay, see you, Charlie. And you said he could stay." And it's just, this is one of the funniest scenes in the film. And Miller was great. I mean, I know his background was predominantly in, sitcoms and stuff like that, but he's very good at his comic timing. And I think that the line deliveries in these scenes in particular, and then I'm saying this and I'm thinking ahead to when the two guys are having breakfast and they tell the story about the shooting of the animal. And that's a very serious moment in the movie. So he was really good at drama too. But his comedic side is really great here. And he is playing a character very different from the dad character in Please Don't Eat the Daisies. But still, it's got that same kind of comic approach.
Well, and also the interplay between the two of them. I'm just seeing this full history, and Bonnie's expression after Sissy Spacek kisses Mark Miller, and then she goes down the hallway, is that Miller had stolen a girlfriend of his somewhere in the past.
That's why you say an ugly thing.
And
because that's the guy he is.
yeah, exactly. And Markham's still mad about it from 25 years ago or whatever it was.
Yeah, and then at least there's a big revenge plot that's coming up here with the ex-wife. But this is all fun stuff right here. I think this is where the film really starts to find its legs too. I think the humor is really, really prominent here. And it's so interesting that it's a romance movie, but it's also a buddy film.
What is this thing?
Almost equally, And so he's taking these two different kind of genres and putting them together in a space that they would normally be separated. So he does a really great job of it. And it's interesting because who is the star of this film? You know what I mean? Because I think that there's so much equal time given to the three main characters, and so much growth and learning, more so with these two guys, I think, than Ginger. I think Ginger actually knows who she is at this point and is embracing it, where these two guys are still kind of struggling, which is an interesting perspective as well.
Well, it's also showing, and this is, I think, part of the strength in the writing, is that these men are leading their lives, doing the best they can, and in some cases messing up pretty badly. But they're kind of far down the road, and suddenly in drops this free spirit who disrupts like everything that they're used to. Their patterns are completely destroyed, even in the way they interact with each other, which we're about to see.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's great fun to see that, okay, this is the way our lives are supposed to be going and the way our friendship is supposed to be laid out. Well, oops, no. All you need is this one person with a different kind of personality, with a caring streak that is just there for everybody to throw tremendous curves to both of these guys.
Yeah, and it leads to some poignant moments, like you said, we're coming up with where Charlie talks about being lonely, and it kind of comes out of the blue, and I like that a lot. I don't think this is a melodrama, but I do think that they're playing into this sense of melodrama in an exploitation film. Maybe not that uncommon, but to see it here is just really interesting. And I think also working with people who are predominantly stage actors, these two guys in particular, it gives the film just a totally different feel.
No, it does. And when we talk also about the about television films and kind of the, if you will, the dramatic template of the way those movies very often are constructed, the crisis in this movie is only in the disruption of friendships and the life decisions these guys have to make. There is no Irwin Allen flood or anything else, or someone is secretly, from outer space or whatever it might be. This is just all straight human interaction.
I would have liked it, though, if Ginger had been an alien. That would have been an interesting twist that I wouldn't have seen coming.
Ooh, The Stranger Within, Barbara.
But with Sissy Spacek. But yeah, so this, like we were talking about, this is just a really fascinating kind of film that popped up in an era where I don't think a lot of these types of films were being made. And we could talk a little bit about what was in production at this time. I think The Herod Experiment was a film, I guess we could compare it to in a way that was really like, oh, that's so different. You know what I mean? Than what we were coming into with this film. Sisters by De Palma was in production when this went in production. A movie called Evil Come, Evil Go, which did get released, but I've never seen it, but it's about a religious fanatic who murders people who are engaging in sex. Bonnie's Kids, Ray Dennis Steckler's Blood Monster, and The Kansas City Bomber. Those are just a handful of the independent films being made the same time that this was being made, and none of them are like this. You know what I mean? They're all they feel very like they're using a very exploitable elements into their films. All of them are great. I mean, Sisters is a classic, but like, this is just to underline how unique this film was. And that Miller really wanted, now he's from Texas, I think, but he really wanted to help make New Mexico the hub that it would become. And so after he made this movie, he did a lot with the New Mexico Film Commission, but he also gave a presentation on films and filmmaking with an emphasis on making films in New Mexico at a conference that was attended by 7,000 people, including the governor. And so he was really into promoting films there, and he was taking a totally different approach at doing it, which I think was probably pretty attractive to the people of New Mexico at the time. Because it wasn't like, let's come in here and do just like a boobs and blood film. Let's make a little lighthearted comedy with some drama, and you can do it and you can get it distributed. Now, of course, he was still fighting for distribution at this point. And something really interesting that I just want to mention as a point of trivia is that before this movie played theatrically, it actually played on airplanes. Now, I found an article from Variety dated April 25th, 1973, that reported Ginger in the Morning was being shown in airplanes despite not having yet a theatrical release. And I think the theatrical release might have come sort of concurrently or was right there. So they wrote, quote, "A case in point is producer Mark Miller." So they're talking about movies on airplanes, whose Ginger in the Morning is now showing on several airlines without ever having been commercially distributed. So Miller made the airline deals himself without a distributor. And then he talks about how he thinks he's going to get a third of the profits, a third of the budget back just on showing it in airplanes. He said, quote, between the airlines and the motel, hotel, closed circuit syndicates, you can make back your money today without ever distributing theatrically. The markets in film are expanding, end quote. So he's also kind of very savvy because this predates pay-per-view for sure. But he was looking at all these different places that he could distribute this film and get it seen. And so something that started as a play ended up becoming kind of a groundbreaking film in terms of how he looked at distributing it. And that was a thing. I can't remember the name of the film now, but George C. Scott made a movie where he was trying to bypass the MPAA, so he was distributing it himself. Was it called
The Savage is Loose.
Yeah, The Savage is Loose. And at the time, that was a very difficult process. I think it's probably still difficult. And but it was very groundbreaking. I think Billy Jack, the people who made Billy Jack also did some interesting groundbreaking things with getting their film distributed. So, but he was on the forefront of that. And I don't know that people have talked about it enough. I don't think this airline story was very prominent or has been. But I think it's a really interesting piece of trivia about the history of the film.
Well, of course, at that time, the idea of showing on airplanes, and was I want to say the title of the film, I believe, was Fade In, the Burt Reynolds movie. That was also airline distributed, and this is back in the days when airline prints were in 16, and that was how they were shown. And a lot of people, they looked at the airline thing as, oh my God, it's the last rung of distribution. Let's just throw in the towel and sell it to the airlines and what have you. But you're right. Mark Miller took a different approach, and he opened up that door in a way that somebody like Jerry Lewis also followed, because he became very, if you will, pro-airline distribution, and even wrote about it in his book.
Wow. Yeah, that is not something I knew. And another thing I wanted to point out, and I think you would know more about the process, but this was apparently shot on tape and then transferred to film. And I don't know exactly how that works, but I think at the time that was a pretty new technology, wasn't it, Courtney?
Absolutely brand new. And somebody else who actually was involved with Laugh-In, George Schlatter, now he shot a feature on video in a different process before his transfer, called Norman, Is That You?
Oh, yeah.
And that was, but that movie does not look good. And this was a real experiment in trying to do exactly that. And of course, shooting in New Mexico, doing the filming in this way with using this technology, huge cost-cutting elements there. And,
yeah, it was a movie made for less than $1 million. The other movie I'm thinking of, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, but if memory serves, I think Ted Post used the same approach with that movie Sandcastles, the TV movie with Jan Michael Vincent and Bonnie.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, so yeah, it was a really interesting approach, but I don't know enough about the technology, and I know you do, so I wanted to run that by you. But yeah, I agree. Like shooting on video is definitely makes things easier. So he was probably able to achieve more. And I do know that, so here they're in Santa Fe, and the exterior scenes in this part of the film, they redressed the plaza, which is the main part of Santa Fe's. I don't know if it's downtown or not. I've been to the plaza. It's really beautiful. And they redressed the whole thing because they shot this, March and April. And so that in and of itself was probably kind of expensive, but you can afford that when you can kind of cut costs in other corners, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So it gives this film this very interesting aesthetic. And I like that it is also set at New Year's. And I don't know that Miller is really interested in holidays, but he made a movie called Christmas Mountain, which is a Christmas film. I think it's Christmas Mountain, the story of a cowboy angel, where Slim Pickens, I can barely say his name, plays the angel. And Mark Miller is this cowboy that has this kind of change of heart during Christmas. And I find it really interesting that he's using the same time, like the same holiday era. I'm not using the right phrase, the same period of time to like kind of tell these stories.
Well, again, he was a kind of a family-oriented man, and so the holidays were significant. And of course, here we are. We had Susan Oliver as the ex-wife, who seems determined to grind him out like an old Pall Mall.
Well,
And
he's not nice to her. He
he's
tells her
not.
she's fat, and it's like she's this stunning beauty, and it's like, oh my God, it's such an interesting relationship, especially the way it concludes at the end. But it's this idea of like he missed a lot of his old life of being married, and he talks about it with Joe in some poignant ways about missing his kids. And I think that's why we find out later when she threatens, she's like, if I don't get my child support by Monday, I'm suing you or whatever. And I think the whole reason why he withholds child support, because he's the character has money, that's clarified because he's buying this ranch and all this stuff. But is that I think he thinks if he holds out on her, he's going to get access to his kids. And he misses this like family life that he had, which is really beautifully played out kind of subtly. And I think Susan Oliver is great in this. And you and I were talking about her. She's this amazing person. She actually spent a lot of her youth in Tokyo because her father worked for the information agency there, the U.S. Information Agency. And then she went to Swarthmore College and then went to the Neighborhood Playhouse School of Theater. And she was a huge stage actress. She was in Broadway productions of The War on Murray Hill and Look Back in Anger. But I guess she's probably best known for Peyton Place, the nighttime soap opera. I'm talking about melodrama here, and her character was Anne Howard, and she played that from 1964 to 1999. But she was in everything. She was in the pilot for Star Trek.
I was going to say, let's give the nerds
Yeah,
their
yeah.
bit. Yes, she
Yes.
is the green slave girl in the pilot.
And I think she's in
yes.
a pretty pivotal episode of The Fugitive. Maybe it might be the pilot. I can't recall now. Murder, She Wrote, Magnum P.I., Love Boat, Medical Center, Simon, Bonanza. I mean, the list just goes on. But she was also a pilot.
She sure was.
She flew planes. She began learning to fly in 1964, and by 1967, she flew a single-engine Aero Commander 200 miles or 200-something miles across the Atlantic Ocean alone from New York to Denmark, so more than that, 2,000 miles. At the time, she wanted to end her trip in Moscow, but the government denied her request. And in 1970, she won the Powder Puff Derby, which is an annual transcontinental air race for women. And she was also named Pilot of the Year by the Association of Executive Pilots. So, I mean, this is a really fascinating woman. And you and I were talking about this before the recording, but the way I see Sugar and the way I see Susan Oliver are two totally different people. And once I learned about her, I was like, oh, yeah, this woman would never go back to him. But Sugar would. And something you brought up to Courtney, and I don't know if you have any, filled, more... Oh, what's the word I want to use? I'm losing all my words here. Deeper thoughts on it, but you mentioned that her name is Sugar, and of course Sissy Spacek plays a character named Ginger. And what do you think that means?
Well, to me, it just really meant kind of the contrast, because certainly that's two entirely different tastes. But if you will, Ginger is the one that has the more bite to it, and the Sugar, the name of the character, really is in contrast to her and Mark Miller's relationship. And one thing too about Susan Oliver and her flying is she did all of this incredible accomplishment as a pilot after two really terrifying and traumatic incidents in airplanes, including a crash.
Ooh.
And she was not flying, but as a passenger. And this is like, well, I'm going to beat this. So that took an awful lot of guts to go in and take hold of this and not only excel at it, but become a champion. And she was also a championship glider pilot.
And she would go on to direct too. I read she directed episodes of MASH and Trapper John, which is sort of the in name only sequel to MASH. And yet she managed this extremely prolific career. I pulled her filmography just from the year she shot this to the year it was released, and I won't go over everything she was in, but she appeared in stuff like Night Gallery, Sarge, I mentioned Gunsmoke, Circle of Fear, The FBI, The Magician, Barnaby Jones, Petrocelli, Police Story, in an episode of Police Surgeon, and that's just part of her filmography in 2 years. I mean, was just an incredibly impressive person. Just really bright too, and she's great in this because I think her background in soap operas really plays into how she performs here. Like here, she's being sort of larger than life, and even the way, and we mentioned this before the recording, her wig and the way she dresses, it's all very kind of over the top. And it's almost like she's sort of a precursor to what we would see in stuff like Dynasty. And she's just eating it up in all the right ways in these scenes.
And yeah, this is well, that's the thing. I'm sure that when reading this script, and she said, "I'm going to do something with this character," as you pointed out, even that her natural hair peeks out from underneath the wig at times, which also to me isn't an error. It is part of Sugar's character that she wouldn't pay attention to something like that. If she got excited or upset, here we go. She covers herself up. And if you will, Sugar's fury is what drives her. And even if she completely falls apart and her clothes get disheveled or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Her focus is going to be on disrupting his life.
Yeah, she's very passionate about it.
Yes, she is.
I also think it's interesting that you're pointing that out, because I'm thinking about her character here, and this idea too, that the idea of the wigs and the over-the-top outfits are a way of hiding herself from these things that she really wants, right? So the anger comes out, but it's coming out that she wants to come back to him as much as he wants to come back to her. But there's who's going to say it first? Who's going to come first and say, "I need you," right? And so when she puts the boa over her face, I think, oh, that's such an interesting sort of symbolism for this. I have to hide the real feelings, and I have to let the anger come out and sort of direct things. But I also agree that she is very angry about some of the marriage too, as much as she wants him back, and she just channels it here. And she also, I think it's interesting because we don't get a lot between Sugar and Ginger in this film. We'll have a scene coming up where they're talking, but she, and I used the word earlier, where Ginger advocates for herself, Sugar advocates for her too. In this scene, she's like, "You don't have to stay here and take this from these men. You can come with me, and this is going to be a place where you can, think things out, or you can be pregnant without having to worry about these two men trying to figure out who the father is, what they're going to do. You can figure out what you want to do." And I think that that's really important too. And so, although we don't see a lot of female bonding in this, I think that's a really poignant moment in the film for me, that she sticks up for this woman that she hardly knows, that I think a lot of older women might not stick up for, in another film. Like, this younger woman comes in, takes this guy by storm, and here's this woman who's been rejected by the man she loves, and she could approach this a totally different way, but she doesn't, right? She sticks up for the woman, and that's just such an important moment for me.
Well, and also too, given when this movie was made, I think you've just hit it right on the nose. Is that the shifting mores and all of that stuff was going on, and a lot of it had happened. The sexual revolution had really, it was full force, and actually would later kind of diminish a little bit. But everybody had to look at things in a different way when this movie was made. And I think that's also part of the film. And for Monte Markham's character here, sitting or listening to this tremendous domestic fight, and as you said, you have two people and they should be saying the things that either one would love to hear. But that is absolutely also Monte Markham's problem in this thing, is he is not saying what he should be saying to Ginger.
Yes, exactly. I wanted to talk a little bit about Clark Palo, who's the producer on this, mostly because he would work with Miller on a couple different films. I think he worked on Savannah Smiles and Christmas Mountain. Before he did this, he did a movie called Hex, which is a really kind of cool Western, which starred Christina Rains and Scott Glenn and Keith Carradine, which was a story from Vernon Zimmerman, who made Fade to Black in 1980. He also worked on films like The Hand, as Oliver Stone, The Hand, and Bog. But just a few years after this, his biggest project to date would show up, and that's when he became an associate producer on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He was actually a production manager on set, and he sort of got promoted and did both jobs. So he had a fascinating background. I couldn't find out a lot about him, but it turns out he broke into show business by literally breaking into RKO Studios, and he scaled the fence, and he went to all the bungalows and knocked on the doors and asked for work. And he got some. A producer took him under his wing. So his first big gig would come in 1943 when his story Cowboy Commandos was purchased by Monogram and made into a film starring Ray Corrigan. And then that same year, he worked again with Ray Corrigan, but as an associate producer on a film called Land of the Hunted Men. So his background also came from Westerns. And he was just a really fascinating guy, and he formed some kind of friendship with Mark Miller because he showed up in all of Mark Miller's major. Now, Christmas Mountain was made, I don't know if it was meant to have a theatrical release. It ended up being direct to video, I believe. But he worked on all of Mark Miller's like kind of non-TV projects that Miller had written, which is pretty interesting. And it goes back to this idea of things being a family affair, because we've seen the director's wife, Miller's wife appear in this. Clark Palo would go on to work on all of the Miller projects, at least in the 80s. And so you're seeing a lot of like, he's working with these people and he's forming friendships with them, and they're coming up later, like the way he attached David Doyle to the original theatrical production of Savannah Smiles, which ended up not happening.
Yeah. Oh, and just with David Doyle, of course, this was, his enduring fame, I guess, truly as Bosley on Charlie's Angels.
Yeah.
But for me, it was one of his rare roles as a bad guy. He is the gang leader who goes after Clint Eastwood in Coogan's Bluff.
Ooh.
And,
Yeah, he was great. He was also had a really interesting role in Paul Walker's The Comeback, where he has kind of this gender fluid, really interesting, weird character. And I think that came out while Charlie's Angels was in production. And I'm always fascinated with actors who take on these roles that kind of, I don't want to say they would, I guess they become press nightmares in that they challenge the role that people associate them with, and I think he did that. And he started acting when he was a child. I think he was in a community theater production with Life with Father when he was like 8 or 10 or something, and he was really into like embodying the characters that he played. And he did get kind of known for a couple of very particular roles. Bridget Loves Bernie was a big role for him as well, and then Charlie's Angels. But he was all over the place in terms of an actor. He really liked to challenge himself, and he was great in everything.
And also a very, very, had a superb reputation just as a man because of the marriage to his wife, which was enduring, and she was blind.
Yeah, I didn't know that till you told me that.
And in fact, when Monty and I would talk, he really loved David Doyle. He just thought he was a great guy. But he said that was like everybody knew that. And he just said that David, of course, didn't make a thing about it. It was his, home life. But he just said everybody just so admired him for not only his acting chops, but was just a really decent fellow and not a ne'er-do-well, if you will.
That's always so great to hear. And Miller had a lot of projects in the works at this time when he was making this, not just Savannah Smiles, but there was a movie he wanted to make called Bigamy Jones, and he wanted James Caan to be in it. There was another movie he had Raquel Welch in mind for. He had the cast pretty fleshed out for Savannah Smiles. There was a play he'd written, and it seemed like every time he was doing interviews in this era, he was kind of promoting a new project. So you had mentioned that he had done theater and stuff until he died. He lived to be like 97,
He sure did.
And he was working very heavily in theater. And at one point he was living in Taos. I think he might have relocated it in his older years back to California to be with his children. I can't remember, but he was I think in his obituary they were saying he was just running around directing and writing and wanting to work. He had stuff in the works at 97 like that weren't completed because he was currently working on them. Real passionate filmmaker. And also making really unique films. I mean, when I talk about like the family orientated nature of all of them, and one of the things, it might be better suited to the end, but like one of the things that struck me about Savannah Smiles was that it was kind of a goofy comedy about these two ex-cons who end up accidentally, quote unquote, kidnapping a girl who's running away from home, and she crawls into the backseat of their car. And it's mostly about how Miller's character comes to terms with this really dark childhood past that he had by giving Savannah kind of hope for her future growing up with the family that has basically been ignoring her till this point. And it's got this really poignant ending. And I found that this film also has a really poignant ending. And I thought it was interesting that the way he intertwines these kind of really poignant and dramatic moments into the film. But I know you want to talk about Slim Pickens, he just came on the screen. I didn't mean to overtalk through him.
No. This Slim, of course, was so busy and so consistently working during this time. So and obviously he enjoyed working with Mark Miller, and they became friends, and Mark would use Slim whenever possible. And this was at the height of Slim's collaborations with Sam Peckinpah, because this was right around the same time as The Getaway, and also immediately, I believe, almost immediately before this film, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. And, of course, too, this very same year, or the year that this was released, Slim was Blazing Saddles.
That's right.
Along with a lot of other stuff. So he was,
Pregnant.
Slim had reached that point in his career where the audience recognition was so enormous. All you had to do was point the camera at him.
Yes.
And suddenly everybody is paying attention, and everybody knows who he is.
Yeah, talk about presence. He just oozed it. And I know him mostly, I would say, for his TV work. It always comes back to TV for me. But the first thing I remember seeing him in as a kid was actually This House Possessed, which is a TV with Parker Stevenson and Lisa Eilbacher. And he plays Parker Stevenson's manager. Parker Stevenson plays a pop singer, and he's the manager. And he's got this very likable persona, that great accent. And then he would do stuff like Love Boat, So I came up knowing him as this very genial, lovable kind of older guy. But he started a long time ago in westerns, and you and I were talking before recording about how they loved casting him in those because he got his first horse when he was 4 and joined the rodeo circuit as a teenager, and he was very proficient with horses. So they knew that they wouldn't need a stand-in with him. So he had great talent, but he also helped save money, because they knew that he could get on a horse and not get hurt and shoot his own scenes. And
Slim was so physically large, and the thing was too, of course, he had been not just things like, he rode broncs, or he did this, that, and the other, and calf roping and things like that. Now, Slim Pickens is about the most dangerous thing you can do when you're involved in rodeo, and that was he was a rodeo clown.
That's right.
And those guys really take their lives in their hands, because they're trying to save the lives of the cowboys who fall off the animals and whatever. And now you're the one who has to deal with that wild animal while the cowboy gets hauled off.
Yeah.
And that is really rough stuff. And that was Slim's life. And until he was finally cast, because he was working with the animals on the Errol Flynn Western, Rocky Mountain, directed by William Keighley. And it's a really, really good movie. And a lot of which was cannibalized for the pilot to Cheyenne, starring Clint Walker.
Oh, interesting.
Which was the old Warner Brothers way, that they would just chop things up and use them in their television shows. But once Slim got going, and of course, too, we always love that one of the most famous images in probably the history of film is him riding the atomic bomb in Dr. Strangelove.
Yes, iconic.
And, everyone has always made such a deal out of the fact it says Dear John on the bomb, but that actually was the name of Slim Pickens' horse.
That's great.
And that's why they painted it on there, because he said he'd never ridden anything that wasn't Dear John, so they accommodated him.
That's amazing. I also wanted to mention, when we were talking about Mark Miller taking a chance on kind of talent that was on the rise, this movie he did in conjunction with a woman named Barbara Singer, and I had a really hard time finding information on her, but she was from Texas, and she got attached to this film just shortly before they went into production. She only has 2 online credits according to IMDb. It's this film and a short film called Swan Song. But she was actually the president of a company called Cine Rep Productions, which were based in Houston. So in 1971, she was trying to get a film in production called Amigos. I don't think it was ever finished, but her company was actually known for making educational films, and she was looking to branch out. And the year before she went into production on Amigos in 1970, she became a member of the Texas Film Commission, which had been founded in 1970. So it's even newer than the New Mexico Film Commission, which started in 1968. But after that, she kind of disappears from the news. But I find it interesting because we were talking about like the background that some of these people have with children's programming and family affairs stuff. And so she was making educational films before this. And the guy who did the score for this, Don McGuinness, would go on after this to predominantly do animated things like My Little Pony, The Muppet Babies. He did Pink Panther in the Olympics. But prior to this, he did a lot of kind of grindhousey films. He scored Al Adamson's movies Jesse's Girls, Psycho Go-Go, among many others. And he also did the slasher film Blood Song, which had Richard Jekyll in it and Donna Wilkes, and the teen comedy Making the Grade, which is a very eclectic film career. But I wanted to mention him, and since we're talking about background in like children and family stuff, it's all over the place in this film, which I find really interesting. And I like that he took in Barbara Singer for this, because this would I think really be her first big theatrical film. And she may have gone on to other stuff, but it would have been behind the scenes, and I haven't been able to find much else out about her.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned Don McGuinness, because he was absolutely the go-to guy for Adamson and all of these other guys who were doing their movies through places like Independent International, which I think very often now, and you hear people talk about independent movies from this period, and I mean exploitation pictures. Quite honestly, Independent International was about as bottom rung. That was not working for Roger Corman. That wasn't even working for Charles Band or any of this. That was, that was hitting the basement. And even with great people in them, like whether it's John Carradine or Scott Brady or whoever it might be. But those films were really made for peanuts. And McGuinness did so much work for them because he could do so much with so very little. And that's why he became so valuable to all these producers who would then hire him. And he was used to working with these incredible compromises. And yet, when given the opportunity, because there was more money available and everything else, he always stepped up. And the work isn't particularly well known, which I think is a shame, because this was a guy who really had to, the pressure put on him to save some movies that, weren't necessarily particularly good. And the music did the job.
It's also interesting to bring up Al Adamson here, because his movies were also very much a family affair, right? His wife was in a lot of his films, and he used a lot of the same people over and over again, including Don McGuinness. And so I think that's something maybe that we'll see probably a lot in the world of B movies when you think about it. Because I mentioned earlier The Hitchhikers, which was produced by Fred and Beverly Sebastian, right? Married couple. And so there were all kinds of like these interesting sort of families. The Sederises, of course, used a lot of their family members in their films. And so it's not something you see in Hollywood. It's pretty unique to the indie scene, I think, more so. And it's a really fascinating aspect, I think, to that kind of filmmaking.
Well, and the thing was, independent movies during this time, and it was way different than it is now. But, of course, they were looking for theatrical distribution. Some movies only played in certain parts of the country. And it goes the entire gamut. It goes from movies like this, horror pictures, raunchy comedies. It even goes all the way to adult films, all made with money borrowed from a bank, or somebody who's mortgaged their house,
right,
or something like that, and that the filmmakers themselves are responsible for the cash. It's not like, this is on a drawing account from Paramount. And at the time this movie, of course, was being made, speaking of Paramount Pictures, this is the era, The Godfather was coming up, and Chinatown was coming up, and The Longest Yard, and all these movies. In fact, Godfather Part 2 was in theaters when this came out. that's pretty heady competition.
Yeah.
And the fact that some of these movies survived at all, and we're not talking about indies that got big distribution. This isn't Walking Tall. This isn't Billy Jack. And that's interesting. I think it's almost like a minor miracle, but that means that the films have, if you will, gravitas that wasn't appreciated maybe when in fact they were made.
Yeah, I mean, it just shows a real passion too, because you're doing things like by the skin of your teeth at this point, and like reusing the ends of old film stock and stuff like that just to get your stuff on
short
film,
ends,
and
you bet.
And so the trims, and so it's like it's done because you want to make a movie so bad, you know what I mean? And I prefer smaller films like this in the sense that I think the studios can really nuance things to the point that it takes out the heart of the filmmaker, sometimes. And here I think it's a real good look at where Mark Miller's going, like where his thoughts are, the kind of films he wants to make, because we'll see themes repeated over and over again, like this makeshift family kind of thing that he's trying to create. With these four people. You see it in Savannah Smiles with the two convicts and the little girl. You see it in Christmas Mountain, where he plays a cowboy who befriends a Mexican family in a place I don't remember where it takes place now. I think they shot it in Utah, but a place that is very unfriendly to people who weren't white, was the premise of the film, and how he opens up the town's eyes to the potential of maybe being friends with somebody who's different than you. And tolerance comes up again when he did, so we should say his first script was for Please Don't Eat the Daisies. I believe the episode was called The Magnificent Muldoon, and it starred Burgess Meredith, and it has some similarities to this in that it's about a tramp or a train hopper who has a very free lifestyle, who is befriended by Miller's twin children, the youngest children on the show, and they bring him home, and because the father had told them that they need to learn how to be tolerant with people who are different than them, and then the father in the end has to learn to be tolerant of this person that's different than him. And Burgess Meredith is really great in it. And one of the other similarities I see to him and Ginger is that he's extremely literate, and he talks about all these authors that he loves. And in this, she's a poet. And so they kind of share this like love of the word, which I find really interesting too. So you can see in this film and in that themes already starting to arise that he'll use over and over again. And you might not see that in a Hollywood production, And so I think that's what makes these kinds of films really special.
Well, and you brought up one thing about Ginger being a poet. Sissy Spacek has that great line. She really wants to hurt Monte Markham's character, and she says, "You never even asked to hear one of my poems."
That's right.
And she's really upset about that, because that's the thing. He's supposed to care about her and care about her creative life, which is the most important thing.
Yeah, that is
and
interesting.
He's
because
ignored
the
it.
Creative life of the filmmakers here too, right?
Yep.
Charlie, please.
And,
Yeah, there's a lot of neat threads in here, And although I'm not sure about this part with Susan Oliver, I will say, it's don't beg, sugar. But I like that. I like that they find each other again. It's such a sweet little film, And it doesn't mean to do anything except make you smile and make you feel good by the time it's over. And I find that really interesting because I couldn't find any reviews of this movie except one, which came from Mrs. Jo L. Martinez, wife of the state Supreme Court Justice and General Chairman of the premiere festivities where this movie played. And she said, quote, "It was a good show, I thought. It was happy and didn't have a lot of violence of so many of today's movies," end quote. And that was Mark Miller's audience. He wanted people to have these kind of feel-good films and enjoy them. And he was doing them at an era where that was kind of like not happening at all in independent films in particular.
Oh, absolutely true. And in fact, when Monte Markham and I have discussed this movie, he said that Mark Miller, the difficulty that they had finding the distribution really hurt his feelings. Mark Miller and his wife were very upset because he said, "Look, where is the place where this movie should exist?" And the distributors were like going, "Well, where are the vampires? Where are the naked cheerleaders? Where's this? Where's that?" and this movie just did not fit into that category. And of course, too, when you're talking about family films, and this is for the huge independent family films such as Benji, just broke box office records, but everybody still looked to Disney for family entertainment, and made for a lot more money than this was made.
Listen, you two.
Yeah, it's just a really interesting era, and it just flies in the face of everything that was happening at the time. So I can see where it would struggle to get distribution. It was probably a tougher movie to market. And actually the poster, it does encompass what the film is. It's very bright. It's got the yellow in it, and it's got Sissy Spacek's character front and center, and it says something like "Let the sun shine in." And that's kind of basically what the film is. But in terms of getting an audience at that time, in the era of like, we're still in Vietnam, you know what I mean? All this stuff is happening in the country. And I mean, this was produced the same year as Last House on the Left. I mean, that's where people were at that time. There was a cynicism, and this movie just says, I don't take that. And this is another approach or another perspective or another lens to look at the world through. And it was so completely different, I think, than what we were seeing. And so that's what makes it so interesting. And I think so important too, because there were people who felt this way. Clearly, Mrs. Martinez, who left us that beautiful review, felt that way, and it's important to think about like making these kind of feel-good movies at a time when we didn't feel very good.
There's that wonderful episode of Columbo where he has to arrest the movie star played by Ann Baxter.
Yeah.
And he has a speech about that in the episode, where she talks about the older films that she did when she was making musicals and things. And he says, why don't they make movies like that anymore without all that violence?
Yeah.
And I always get a kick out of it, because that, I think, was just a question a lot of people were asking, because it was, of course, I love those movies, but the audience was shifting, but there was also an audience that was being, I think, forgotten.
Yes.
And that certainly a lot of theatrical producers probably assumed that television was filling in the gap for the audience that was not interested in Last House on the Left. And that wasn't necessarily true.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's interesting, too, that Columbo comes to mind for you, because Columbo was also kind of like rejecting the cop show at the time, because like Kojak, and Police Story, like these more Streets of San Francisco, these very kind of gritty shows. And here comes Columbo, who's this one guy who doesn't even carry a gun, and he's this really charming, kind of almost off-putting in that way kind of character. And those, you know what I mean? And it's like they understood their audience. And I think Mark Miller understood that audience too. I think you're right. It was like this kind of forgotten thing. And talking about rejecting these tropes and stuff, I just want to briefly talk about women traveling alone in this era. So, women traveled alone all the time. I mean, all the time. In the 1800s, they were doing it. It wasn't necessarily unusual, but it would eventually become very frowned upon. And by the time we got to the Cold War era of the 1950s, it was fairly unusual to see women traveling alone. And so by 1970, the cultural landscape had kind of shifted somewhat. And we were seeing women doing all kinds of interesting stuff, including flying planes, which we saw with Susan Oliver. But hitchhiking at the time had kind of dates back to the invention of cars, and it wasn't necessarily seen as unsavory at that time, but it was also very much a thing that men did. And so there's been some like articles written about it, and I found this really interesting article called "When Hitchhiking Was Wholesome" by Livia Gershon and she said in 1970 the Canadian Welfare Council concluded that, and I find this quote really amazing, quote, "The problems of girl transients are quite different from the problems of the boys and young men on the roads. Boys, when they wish to do so, can return to a settled and ordinary life, but in many cases a girl's whole chance of happiness is destroyed," end quote. So, okay, what does that mean? I mean, they're saying a woman hitchhikes, her whole life is destroyed, right? And so concerns about hitchhiking started to become really big. I think they first started when Reader's Digest wrote an article about crimes being committed by hitchhikers, not the other way around, in the 1950s. So there were all these articles. In 1969, Parade magazine called hitchhiking a, quote, high-risk sport. The magazine wrote that women are neither, quote, mindful of nor worried about the dangers inherent in thumbing a ride. They seem rather to welcome the challenge, end quote. And the women in that article were depicted as middle-class girls who wanted to see what life was like on the other side. So basically they were saying that they were slumming it and that they didn't really need to be on the road, that they were like come from the upper class. They just want to see how poor people live, right? And it kind of diminishes this idea of women having the freedom to travel, which would have been really important for women in this era. And I also found from the Akala Star Banner, which is a newspaper, in 1971, a deputy at the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office says, quote, "It's like open season for every pervert, homosexual, and creep in the area." And this was to discourage women from hitchhiking. They're saying that basically it triggers men to like rape women. And I think he said, any girl on the road, she's asking for trouble because any guy driving thinks she's loose. So this was the general idea of how we thought of women who hitchhiked. And a lot of the movies kind of embraced that. And there were a ton of these hitchhiking movies in the 70s. The Hitchhikers, Teenage Hitchhikers, Take an Easy Ride, which is short films, Girls on the Road, Thumb Tripping, which had a male and female hitchhiker, Diary of a Teenage Hitchhiker, which is a TV movie. But the women hitchhiking in film dates even farther back than that. And one thing we didn't mention when it was happening, but when Joe and Ginger are leaving the hotel earlier on in this film, she references it happened one night, which, you know, she talks about the scene where they put the clothesline up to
The Walls of Jericho.
Yeah, the Walls of Jericho. But you know that's one of the first scenes of a woman hitchhiking. It was in 1934 when she tries to get a ride and she shows her leg to prove that she can get a ride. So that's a really interesting reference in that. And then there was a movie in 1935 called The Hitchhike Lady, which is about a woman hitchhiking to visit her son, who she doesn't know is in prison. And we had Ida Lupino's The Hitchhiker in 1953, which is about male hitchhikers, but made by a woman. And I find that really fascinating. Really great kind of crime film.
Detour.
Pardon me?
Detour.
Yeah. So like all of this stuff, it kind of predates that. But then we saw it a lot in the 70s. The Strange Vengeance of Rosalie. Hot Summer Week. I think The Hitchhikers has some comparisons to this, the Fred and Beverly Sebastian movie I keep referencing, because that character starts off as pregnant as well, and she thumbs a ride. It starts off real dark. She loses the baby and then becomes part of this like Manson family, and then it's kind of almost pro hitchhiking, but only if you're willing to live a life of crime, which is really hilarious. And it's this weird film. And of course, the TV movies, there was, or I guess TV shows, The Twilight Zone, The Hitchhiker from 1960 is a really poignant thing about a woman picking up a hitchhiker, but he's actually death, or she's trying to avoid the hitchhiker. We had the Hitchhike TV movie from 1974 with Cloris Leachman, where she picks up a guy who's killed somebody. And that one is actually kind of sympathetic towards the hitchhiker, includes the woman who picks him up. And then, of course, we have Diary of a Teenage Hitchhiker, which demonizes all women who hitchhike because it starts off with all the stats about all the violent crimes that are committed against female hitchhikers. And the women in that are very cynical. So you're seeing all of this stuff happening. And usually women pay for it. But here they don't. And I find that so fascinating. And one of the reasons why I think I like returning to this film, you know, and again, I don't think women should go out hitchhiking, but I think it's okay to have a portrait of a woman who doesn't and not demonize her for it.
And no, I agree. And I think also it's very important to note that if you are having trouble in your love life, get Slim Pickens to get a police car and flag down a bus, and that will solve all your problems.
I think Slim Pickens solves all problems for everybody.
I think so too.
Yeah, he's just such a warm cup of coffee or a blanket or whatever for me. But here we're coming.
I really like the way. Oh, I'm sorry. I really like the way this scene is directed because it's kind of the classic, you know, the end of Manpower with Marlene Dietrich and George Raft, and you know the bus reveal. We kind of know how this is going to go, except Sissy Spacek is not in the frame. We don't see her get off the bus. So this really is a little bit of a, guess. What is in fact going to be our conclusion here?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to comment on, because we come on this really kind of beautiful ending. I love the way this film ends with her having been on the other side of the bus and the reveal of her. And I think when you watch Savannah Smiles, you'll see it's equally as poignant, but in a different way. And he's got a real way with endings that I love. They're really warm and poignant. There's just something about them that are really interesting and maybe a little heavy considering the rest of the film.
Well, that's okay, because this is, if you will, Monty's character trying to really make up for all of, let's say, his clumsy sins up to this point. And she accepts it and also knows that she's going to make him a better fellow, which is really kind of the point of the whole thing. And also, since Sissy's getting ready to sing again, as we noted in the credits, they gave her a special notation about the songs, which I'm sure was a big negotiating point for her, because the music was her focus.
Yeah, it was. And she actually, so I think she wrote some of this music after the fact, but the song Sweet Cheeks, which I think she's closing out with here, she wrote during production. So like while they were making the film, I think she was inspired for this song. And she's so great. And she sings in the Girls in Huntington House too. That was something I forgot to mention.
And so here we go. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful, Amanda. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I love talking about this movie. It was great.
And this was a terrific talk.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.